Thank you so much, you guys, for coming by. This is about, obviously, the Vagrant 25 year on the street podcast and just Vagrant in general, kind of celebrating this milestone. And I was curious, you were both on this, the Vagrant Across America tour 2001. I mean, how do you sort of look back on that tour, I guess, or that era of the bands and the label of that time, because it's 20 years later, I guess?
Well, I'll have to defer to Chris on this one, because we weren't actually on the tour. We just came to Chicago for 4 days and got real drunk, and then, yeah, Chris was the one. Dashboard was you were on the whole thing, weren't you?
Yeah, I was on the whole tour, and I think my viewpoint of Vagrant might be a little bit different than Matt's, because I came on both sides of it. I was a fan of the label, like a devoted fan before I was on the label. So I was on both sides. And I think, Matt, when you joined the label, they were not quite in their infancy, but they didn't have a whole huge catalog. There just seemed to be this burst, like right around when your record came out, anniversary and so on, that I was like, it was like that label kind of encapsulated what I loved about music at that time. So it was a real special thing for me to be on the label in the first place and then on that tour with those bands.
Well, it's one of the things that I've really kind of, I think I knew but took for granted before we started doing the podcast, is that we were in fact all actually friends at the time. Like we kind of met each other through this scene. I can hear your cat purring. That's but we genuinely like enjoyed hanging out with each other. Like we enjoyed each other's company. And I think that that's pretty unique. And I don't think I think it at the time.
No, I think I didn't realize how rare that was. I think I definitely loved that, but I didn't know that wasn't how every tour was going to be built forever. And I also think about like I kind of wonder, like, how do we even build those strong friendships all from these different places, like sort of pre-internet? But we got pretty lucky with meeting up in different bands. I know I was in different bands back then, but opening for you in Florida, things like that. And just like there was a commonality of, I don't know, it's just like we all kind of were of like minds back then.
Yeah, I found it really interesting to watch. I know you released kind of like they released a trailer with some video clips from that era, and just it made me feel so old. I mean, just like the fashion, like the weight thing, it just looks like a totally different. Does it feel like a long time ago to you? Does it feel like just a few years ago? I mean, how do you kind of look back, I guess, on that period?
I think it's like, for me, it's like there's like a linear path to what I'm still doing. So though the experience, that specific experience was long ago, certainly this, this style of dress and certain things mark it as a certain era, but it was the first time I'd experienced it with a lot of eyes on it.
Yeah, I would agree with that. It's the first time that we've ever been like public outside of our kind of like scene of friends, Yeah.
So, and it's like, was our scene of friends too, Matt. So like when I think back, I'm not like, oh, remember all those years ago. It's just like, remember that one time I was with Matt among the tons of other times we've been on tour together or just been doing stuff together. That kind of stuff kind of makes it not just a specific moment in time, which would make it seem more dated of an experience, I think, to me.
I find that I have, and I noticed this with Jesse, the guy who produced the podcast, like I have a common shorthand with people of not only our generation, but of that scene, that we're kind of aware of, like, oh yeah, you remember that guy from that band and that guy from, like, oh yeah, I know that guy. And like, oh yeah, we should, get that guy, and it's just something that like, it's hard to explain. It's not like, it's a very like communal thing it's weird because now it's kind of being recognized as such. And I don't think we ever thought about, like, you don't think about things when you're in the moment as like, this is important, this is going to be a thing, and it's just kind of like, yeah, I'm playing shows with my friends. And
no, I didn't think of it as like this magnanimous moment. Is that the right term? I didn't think of it as like this cultural moment, but I did think of it as like, I did feel like I was part of something. I didn't know that it was like a grand thing. I don't know now if it was like a grand thing.
Yeah,
but
same.
but I did feel part of something. I felt like I was part of something that was special to me.
I'd agree with that.
Matt, what's the process been like for you kind of doing this podcast? I mean, it seems like, you know, obviously you're interviewing people like Chris, but interviewing, you know, like Danny from Mission Chinese or Amy from Fiddler Records. I mean, has it been a fun experience kind of reminiscing, or what's the kind of process been like for you?
9 times out of 10, it was just me getting to shoot the shit with my friends and actually having to force myself to stay on track to try and talk about what the podcast is actually about, as opposed to just like catching up with people. But I mean, for the most part, it was a lot of fun. It was a lot of work. It was like we did over 50 hours of interviews. No, I got to hang out. I got to talk to Chris for an hour and a half or maybe even longer, and like get some really interesting perspectives on stuff.
Matt, I'm curious, you know, Something to Write Home About is kind of considered sort of this kind of like breakthrough record for the label at the time. I know you also had your own kind of imprint, Heroes and Villains. I mean, how do you look back on kind of Something to Write Home About and how that kind of, because I'm sure there were many labels you could have kind of signed to put out that record, you know, following 4 Minute Mile.
Well, and this will go more in depth in the podcast, but we tried to sign to major labels. We tried actively for like a year and a half to sign to a major label, and we met with a lot of them, and we met with Sub Pop. We wanted to sign to Sub Pop, and ultimately it came down to like none of them would really take us seriously, and so we ultimately ended up going with Vagrant out of last resort, and then it went really, really well, and so then it was just sort of like kind of it was slightly accidental. You know what I mean? We really were desperate because we had taken so many meetings and we had gotten so close so many times, and it was always just like, and people would be like, yeah, we want you to re-record Don't Hate Me for the new, and we're like, no, and we want you to do this. We're like, no, you got to just let us, you know, be us or whatever. So, I mean, when I lived with Rob Pope, he had a Subway poster of the Weezer Blue album above his bed. So we were like, we're a pop band. Like we want to, you know, be on the radio.
So here's how that like affected a band like mine, where I was afraid of major labels, or maybe not afraid, but just not interested. And I didn't think of myself as somebody that could have any kind of success, a commercial success. I feel like Something to Write Home About, and the success you had with it, but also the way it was worked, like made Vagrant this really viable choice for me. Where, and there was a few of them out there, but where it was like a boutique, like indie label that was like curating a sound.
But they very much, and this came up, and Chris, this came up in your interview, and it came up to the point where I started asking it directly to every single band, is that Vagrant was very hands-off creatively. Like not even very hands-off, like completely hands-off creatively. Like they were like when we were making Something to Write Home About, I think maybe Rich came by once to listen to it. I think Ellis came by one time, but then every single band, it was like, yeah, they just let us do our thing. And they were like, we believe, they really were like, we believe in your music and we don't know how to do it. So you do it. And then we will try to spread it to the world. And I think that's also another thing that was really unique about that label, because I don't think many other labels are like that. Would you agree with that, Chris?
I think, I hate to speak for them, but I got the sense that they knew they signed what they liked because they trusted that they signed what they loved, and they trusted that band being themselves was all they needed to enable.
I would agree with that. Yes. And I think that that's a rare quality in someone who's going to give you a decent chunk of money to go make a record that you might, you know, go on a weird tangent. If you're, not that I've ever done anything like that. That'd be crazy.
Matt, you know, one of the people you talked to, I was curious to ask about, was your Trevor Keith interview, because I think a lot of people might not realize that Face to Face, the kind of Live 10-inch was the first Vagrant release. I mean, because I feel like that seems like a bit of an outlier almost.
A lot of people who had first heard of Vagrant Records before we were there were just like, oh, that's Trevor's label. And I think that's
I remember hearing that too.
Yeah, I think that's what I thought too. And it was just like, I mean, Vagrant was started by Rich in his kitchen, you know, and he put out like this box set of 7-inches, and one of the bands on it was Face to Face. I mean, they're a really big part of the story, especially like foundationally, because it's like, because of Face to Face, Vagrant was able to put out some of those comps, those like Before You Were Punk comps, and sell 100,000 records of them. You know what I mean? Which is like crazy. Like that's just it's insane.
It's a pretty outlandish number.
Yeah. So yeah, I think Face to Face is really like you can't get to the Vagrant America tour without talking about Face to Face. They're a big part of it.
Matt, so what was sort of the story behind really the Vagrant, so the Heroes and Villains kind of imprint?
Well, so Rob Pope and I, when we were talking about signing to a major label, we're like, okay, so if we get an advance, we want to put our advance money into starting a record label, and specifically to put out our friends The Anniversary, because we very much saw this local band that was just like, this band is better than just a local band. They just need someone to light a fire under their ass. And so when the major label thing fell through, one of the things was like, well, we wanted to use that money to start a label. And so Rich was like, well, what if we gave you an imprint? And we're like, okay, can we just sign whoever we want? And he was just like, yeah. And then we said, okay, we're signing this band The Anniversary, and sight unheard by the label. And Rich is like, well, can I hear what they sound like? And so I called up Josh and I was like, Josh, can you send like some of your demos that you did in Chicago to Rich? And he said, sure. And he ended up sending him a cassette tape from the college radio station of a bad local ska band. And that's what he sent to Vagrant, which if you know the guys in The Anniversary and Adrienne, that's very much on brand for them to do something that fucking ridiculous. And Rich calls me, he's like, what the fuck is this? And I'm just like, that's not them. It was really, really funny. But yeah, they just let us sign. I mean, it was The Anniversary and Kofax. And then like our side projects like Reggie and New Ams. And then we just kind of went from there.
Chris, what was it like for you sort of your experience with Vagrants, kind of being a fan of the label kind of prior to signing? I mean, what was your perception like, and what was that kind of experience like?
Well, it was fan based. At that point, what it looked like to me was that Vagrant was this already like this established label that was established with a scene identity, like the kind of music they put out, where there was a lot of, like Matt brought up a couple of, you know, Epitaph and Fat. There was a few labels that were doing punk really, really well. There were a few labels that were doing hardcore really, really well. But this scene, this burgeoning like emo scene, this post-hardcore thing, it didn't really have. It had a few like burgeoning places where it was happening well. And I kept thinking, like, what is it that's so special about Vagrant that they're hitting a home run for me as a fan every time they put a record out? It's like one that is now dear to my heart. And so when I came to the label as an act, I had a trust in that I was like I was going to be part of this kind of, it wasn't a very long tradition, but I was going to be part of this tradition of quality. And I thought that was like the best, I thought that was the only way I would have a chance to have a career, you know, put my music out and have it heard. And I thought it was the best, the place where that chance would be best for me.
Yeah, I mean, I just think it's also like so unique to the period that people cared about Chris, what you're saying about buying everything on a label, like I don't think people still do that in the same way.
I don't see too many labels that have like that kind of label identity. It does happen.
Sure.
So there was a bit of an like an upstart energy about Vagrant too. And I think that there was, like, even in the time that was like, that I'm describing, I think there was already probably some backlash from people, like, who are these guys coming in
It was
and grandstanding or
it was
something.
audacious for sure, because we do come from punk rock, which has less. I mean, I think people pay less attention to the rules now, but when we were coming up, it was very much like, this is what you could do and this is what you couldn't do. And I think it's also because of the derogatory term emo, which kind of at the beginning was like a stand-in for like being weak, and I think that language has evolved over the years.
Well, also it evolved quickly because I don't think I thought of it that way.
It was to us because we somehow ended up in this hardcore scene by being on Doghouse, and we had nothing to do with it. We're from Kansas City. We don't, there's no hardcore scene in Kansas City. There's Coalesce, and that's it. And so it did feel derogatory. And then, there's this, and I've posted this online. There's this, the first time we played at CBGB's, it was one of those mashup shows where you have like two shows that are very different so it was like Monster X and Spaz and these like hardcore grindcore bands, and then us and Braid and Ethel Meserve. And it would be like, we would do like Ethel Meserve would go on, and then a hardcore band would go on, and then Braid would go on, and then 97A would go on. And the flyer that got made for it was like Spaz, grindcore from California, Get Up Kids, some fucking emo band from somewhere, Braid, another wretched emo band from wherever. And so that, I think maybe I'm taking that one flyer to heart too much, but it definitely didn't feel.
I think for those first impressions count.
Yeah,
they do count for something. So for me, it was like these bands that we were like having our minds blown, like, oh, you can have all this melody, but heavy music, or you can have some pop elements to this like a hardcore blast beat or something like that, and things we really liked, and we heard it was called that. We didn't know that was a stand-in for an insult, or that it was taking the piss, when Brian Baker said it or whatever. We just didn't know. So there was like that whole thing. There was like a million names floating around. Right. Like there was post-hardcore, there was indie rock, there was emo, and I did come from a hardcore scene. And none of those hardcore guys used those terms like as offensive statements or anything like that. They just were like, it was like, oh, it was meant to imply they don't just scream.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Matt, you're hitting on something though, like really important. Like obviously maybe not Spaz and Monster X, but I feel like you would go to like Crazy Fest or something, and you would see you would see these super heavy bands. You would see more quote unquote emo bands. And I do feel like, Sonics aside, there was a lot of range in that kind of world.
Well, it's because we're, at least at the time, and the landscape has changed, but we were all part of the counterculture. Like we were part of different countercultures, which with the rise of the internet, now things can get more and more niche, But at the time, it was just like there was mainstream rock radio, and then there was other. And it was just kind of like, so it would be a hardcore band, a ska band, an emo band, and a pop punk band all on the same bill, playing at a VFW hall in Des Moines. And it was our commonality is that we were all misfits.
Well, I guess my last question is sort of like, what is sort of the most, I have one, but like, what's the most surprising thing to maybe come out of like Vagrant for you kind of, in 2021, looking back at that time, like what's one thing like maybe you never would have expected?
That they signed Paul fucking Westerberg. I mean, that was when Jesse and I were like, are we going to get to interview Paul Westerberg? And we were both like, I don't know if I can. I don't know if I would be able to do it. But he didn't end up doing it. So does that answer your question?
Yeah. That's a good one. That's a really good one.
I said it, and I risk of repeating myself. I think I didn't know how unique it was. I didn't know how special it was, and how fleeting it would be. And I guess how much I would, the good and the bad, I take it all, I kind of cherish it all. And then it wasn't all good, but it was all better than what I would see in other places, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's a great answer.
I think that's something that ultimately I hope that people take away from the podcast as a whole. especially when we're talking to when we're talking to the bands of this era, you really learn about, like, I hope that people realize what a unique experience it was.